Welcome to another episode of the Untethering Shame podcast. Today, we're joined by Jane Pilger to unpack the complex relationship between shame and binge eating. Binge eating is often shrouded in shame, making many feel isolated and alone. But Jane helps us see it differently, not as a failure or act of self-sabotage, but as a powerful form of self-protection. Jane, who guides women to transform their relationship with food and themselves, explains that binge eating is a symptom, like a warning light on a car's dashboard, alerting us to look under the hood at deeper, unhealed pain. Instead of focusing on diet plans or restriction, Jane takes us through the 8 common reasons people binge, highlighting how each reason points to a root cause that needs compassion and understanding. We'll explore the difference between subjective and objective binging, how society normalizes binge eating, and how that normalization often intensifies shame and hinders healing. Jane shares tools to reframe how we view ourselves and offers ways to build self-compassion, understand our unique patterns, and begin to make choices that genuinely support our well-being. All right, everyone, let's get settled, let's get comfortable, and let's dive in. Jane, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited. I'm just so excited to be here. And I mean, a podcast all about shame is so, I love it, right? We try to hide with shame. Shame wants to hide. And it's so amazing to be able to just have this space that you've created to talk about this topic of shame that we all experience, but we don't really want to, and we don't want to talk about it, but it's actually talking about it is the most powerful and the most healing thing that we can do.
Oh, absolutely. I know when I was first telling people about what I was going to do for a topic and focus with this podcast, and that it was all going to center on shame, I think because there's still, we're a year plus in with this, almost a year and a half into the podcast, there's still going to be misconceptions. Brene Brown's been talking about shame for a decade. There have been people talking about it well before her. I think many people don't realize that shame is like glitter, that it affects anything it can get its hands on. And that because it's an emotion and it's there it thinks it's being protective, it thinks it's being helpful, you don't extinguish it. It doesn't go away. So when people are like, well, how are you going to have a whole podcast on this one thing? I'm like, because that's the point. And that's really my focus when it shifted away from kind of the idea of healing shame or getting to a place of resolution was really around shame resilience. What can we do knowing that we're going to feel these things? We're going to have these fears, these thoughts. What do we do with it so we don't get stuck inside of those shame and blame feedback loops, but also not romanticizing the idea of healing or treatment or whatever someone wants to call it to say, well, I can get to a point I don't ever have this, because that's only setting them up to feel like they're failing and that they somehow can't reach some mountain summit that they've assumed other people can.
Yes. And it's so relatable to the topic of binge eating, because so many people, I just want to get rid of it. I want to never binge again. I want to get rid of it. I want to never think about it.
Yes.
I want that to just be gone and eradicated. And I do believe that for some people it is possible. I'm not here to say that binge eating is something you have to deal with for your entire life.
Right.
I do believe that it is possible to get to a place where it's just a very different relationship.
Yeah.
And you will still be somebody who has a relationship with food. And so if those behaviors show up sometimes, it's not a failing. It doesn't mean we're backsliding. It doesn't mean that we're now never going to get over this. So it really, and shame and binge eating are so tied together that, this is just such a great conversation to have on this podcast with this topic.
Yeah. And I know, we could already dive full in. And so I'll be mindful. We come back out to the surface to give people a definition and talk about a few of those things too. But I think as you're saying that, when I was in the depths of my eating disorder, so my mom struggled with multiple addictions. Her drug of choice was crack cocaine. And she and I often talked as she got sober from drug use, and I was working on recovery from my eating disorder. how different that is, where she can design a life where her substance of choice she can live without, and my substance of choice I cannot. I cannot live without that. And so it would be like asking somebody, yes, it's not the exact same. They have different effects on the body to some degree, blah, blah, blah. But it'd be like asking somebody that struggled with a crack addiction to have crack in their life every single day and to never feel like they're going to have a hard day with it. And so recognizing that, even though that's a very extreme statement to make, and again, for listeners that are like, but it's not the same, I understand that. It is a different level of destruction. What I'm saying is we forget that when we struggle with our relationship with something or someone that we need to have in our life, it's going to be an iterative process of working on that relationship. And so the idea that you can just wipe your hands clean and everything's going to be fine and you're never going to struggle again isn't fair. And it does set us up to feel this. Okay. So before we dive into the shame piece of it, I know this would come up a lot for people in the therapy room. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what binge eating actually is, and that there is really this objective definition, but there's also the subjective experience of a binge. And both of those need to be talked about in the context of our relationship with food and healing. So, can you describe for us what is binge eating from a much more objective perspective, and then maybe layer in for us the nuance of what subjective binging means?
Yeah. So I don't really I will tell you kind of how I look at binge eating, kind of how I define binge eating. You can go into, the DSM and various manuals and look at all that. And I'm not going there, but in general, for just a broad definition for our audience, binge eating is eating large amounts of food, typically more than would be consumed at one time, in a short period of time, often with a sense of feeling out of control. So, feeling unable to stop. It is often done in secret, and there's usually a large amount of shame
Mhm.
involved afterwards.
Mhm.
So, those are really just kind of the key components of a binge. Sometimes, not always, sometimes it can be unusual not quantities, but unusual combinations
Mhm.
of foods, or foods maybe you might not normally eat. So
Mhm.
there's kind of like the things you're eating as well as the quantity you're eating, but the sense of an inability to stop, a sense of kind of a loss of control, that doing it in secret, and that shame, those are kind of all of the hallmarks really of a binge.
And what, in your experience and perspective, when people are like, I feel like I can't stop, they eventually stop the binge. And I know commonly that is from physical pain. Like they cannot
Yeah.
eat more, or there's an interruption. Maybe somebody comes home or something like that.
Yep.
Are there other things that often end the binge, or are those kind of the predominant
I
stoppers?
would say those are the predominant ones when I really think about my own personal experience, as well as thinking about, working with all of the clients. I'm trying to think that I really do think those are the two primary. There's either as you go through the process and you realize, wait, I'm actually not as out of control as
Mhm.
it feels. As you go through the process, you're able to bring more awareness into that moment,
Yeah.
and you're able to kind of have this, oh wait, maybe I actually can. That happens in the healing process.
Right.
But for somebody who's kind of in this, like, I literally can't stop,
Yeah.
the two primary ways or reasons they stop is a true physical, I cannot put any more in. I know for me, I would get to the place where I would be sweating.
Mhm.
I would have sores in like the sores in the roof of my
Yep.
mouth, trying to get it in.
Mhm.
Um, and then just the pure stomach, just
Discomfort. Yeah.
pain. Yeah. So that, or like you said, an interruption. A meeting is getting ready to start. Somebody comes home.
Mhm.
Somebody walks in, or that type of thing. Then those would be the two primary reasons. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think just to kind of recap that for listeners, the big thing when we're talking about binge eating is that it is an abnormal amount of food for you, we'll say, an extreme
Hmm.
level of food intake. Oftentimes, it can be foods. I know for me, a lot of the times when I would binge, it was foods that my binging developed after I had restricted for a period of time. And so what had happened for me a lot was cutting out certain foods that I quote unquote shouldn't eat or could not have. So binges were often those foods that were taboo.
Yes.
And I would usually eat those. I definitely did some of the weird combinations for food as well. And weird to me, I suppose. Maybe there are other people that eat them in different ways. But I would have that. I was definitely, that second point then of eating until you feel sick. And the shame often is existing, at least for me, it was twofold. Shame in the moment of knowing what I'm doing and feeling like I can't stop it. And that feeling of
Mhm.
being out of control and all of the stories that come to us based on the culture that we live in, the feelings that we have, both about being in control, but also feeling gross, being lazy, all of those stories are coming in. And then typically the second layer of shame, which would happen when I was done, sometimes that night, sometimes the next morning of I should have known better and I can never
Yes.
do this again. And if somebody
Yes.
found out, what would they think of me? And so there was kind of this double fold that then you just try to run away from and
Yes.
don't deal with, which then, sets you up to end up engaging in this behavior again because the shame until at least for me, I started doing the digging, was all around the eating, not around anything underneath it. So I was only responding to the eating and not going, why am I binging? What's going on here
Yes.
for me? There's something my body is telling me. Instead, it was body, get your shit together and stop doing this because this is not okay. Nobody can know that we're doing this behavior.
Yes. Yes. 100%. I mean, I just resonate with so much of that in that initially it's like we do pay attention to the food and it
Hmm.
makes sense because we're eating these enormous amounts of food that feel unreasonable. Like how is it even? I mean, I remember thinking that my very first binge it was in my first semester in college, which is a very common time to develop disordered eating. I received a care package, and this care package was filled, it was in October, and it was filled with, miniature candy bars.
Hmm.
And I don't remember the binge itself, but what I do remember is sitting on my floor in the dorm room, surrounded by this empty box and empty wrappers
Hmm.
all around me. And I had eaten the entire box. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, what have I done?
Hmm.
How did I just eat all this food? No way can anybody find out. I would not talk to anybody. And because I didn't want anybody to think that I was weak
Hmm.
or out of control, which is exactly how I felt.
Hmm.
And so there was so much of my attempt to stop binging was very much around, it was around the food. Okay, if I can just change either what I'm eating or what I'm around. It was a lot around that and very much nobody can know.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even the binging itself, driving around, I was talking to somebody about this the other day. I was remembering after I got out of college, when I was in college, I binged in my dorm room. I lived by myself. It was very easy to do. Later on, especially once I got married, I was married before I told my husband
Hmm.
about any of this. And so I couldn't really binge at home. And so I did a lot of my binging in the car. And I would drive around and I would, as I was eating, if I would pull up to a car at a light, I would make sure to strategically place myself in their blind spot. So I would
Hmm.
either be just above their car or
Hmm.
just behind them so that they couldn't look over and see what I was doing.
Hmm.
When I would go to the convenience store to buy candy or whatever, or even go to the bakery to buy baked goods,
Hmm.
I would just buy like 2, 3 things at a time, enough to get me to the next
Next
stop.
stop. Yeah.
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 And it's so interesting. I mean, I think for many of us, the idea around, I had this relationship early in my eating disorder recovery. And then honestly, even into when I was getting my degree and knowing that this is what I wanted to specialize in. I had been in recovery at that point for, I think, maybe 7 years at the time. But I still had this like frustration whenever anybody would talk about eating disorders as just a control problem. of feeling out of control, so they have to control something, or feeling like they have to control everything, and so then, a binge is just their way to be like, "Fuck it," and they don't know how to deal with their emotions, whatever that is. But it was this idea that it was just an oversimplification, and I think
Yeah.
because of that, I weirdly I felt more shame around it because I should be able to handle and control everything. But then I also used it as a detachment that there could be something more to it than that, that there's a
Mm.
reason that maybe control needs to be a part of the conversation, that there's a reason that we need to talk about dysregulation in the body and my lack of emotional and physical connection to myself. And so I'm thinking about this for people that are going, okay, a binge makes sense to me. I understand that. You talked about secrecy, and I think that's a really key thing because I also see people binging regularly in front of people. Like we mentioned right before we started recording, like Thanksgiving is an example, or holiday get togethers are often an example where you see people having exorbitant amounts of food. I remember aunts and uncles that would eat to the point that they would unbutton their pants at the table and talk about how full and how sick they felt, but they would eat that much food. So that is still objectively a binge, but missing that shame, that privacy piece. So, how come we've created this norm where we can binge in these socially acceptable ways? And then what is it you think that makes it where we binge in private? And why are those different? Why are we okay with one side and not the other?
I think it's really what we make it mean, right?
Mm.
If I'm choosing to eat a lot of food at Thanksgiving, and I'm eating to the place where I need to unbutton my pants, and I'm totally happy with, like, that was amazing, that was so good, I wanted to eat that much food, and yeah, now I need to, now I need a little more space because my stomach is so distended, but I feel like I made that choice. I think it's really
Mm.
I made the choice to eat this much food versus I don't really feel like I didn't choose that. I
Yeah,
didn't choose that, but I just felt compelled. Like I
right.
couldn't stop. I couldn't help myself.
Right. Like I'm watching my body from above, picking this food and eating it, wanting to stop it. I'm screaming to myself and I can't make myself stop.
Yes.
Versus I may still feel a little bit crappy that I had a couple bites or a couple pieces of pie or I ate all these foods, but I felt in control of it in those
Yes.
moments. Okay. And so, oftentimes I'm assuming, you started experiencing binging in college. That's when my eating disorder showed up, I think, in full force too. And at the time, not really recognizing that there was a connection to something deeper. You're now here at this point where you are working in your recovery. You are seeing that there's something more than we need to just talk about food. How did you get to that point? Where was your breaking of your cycle? How did you get to a point where you realized I'm binging? I don't like this. There's something deeper. What was your intervention point?
It's so interesting. For me, I would say it was a long process. So there wasn't like one, this broke the cycle,
Right.
or this was my intervention point. It really, like, I can really see like different steps on the path if I look back. And so, like, the very first one was seeking out an eating disorders specialist
Hmm.
because that is the only person who felt safe enough to talk to.
You started therapy or started working with a specialist. Did your husband at this point, because you mentioned like you did it in secret, did he know yet or no?
No,
Okay.
not yet.
Okay.
No. This eating disorders therapist is the one who really encouraged me to share about what was happening
Ah,
with loved
yep.
ones. And so I can remember the first conversation. So my husband was the first person that I told.
Hmm.
And I remember that conversation like it was yesterday.
Mm.
I was terrified. I was so sure. I was just sure he was going to leave me. I was sure he wasn't going to love me
Mhm.
because I did not love myself. There was just no way. If he knew that I did this, there's
Right,
no way that he could still love me.
right.
And we were in our bedroom. I was laying on my back on the bed, and I had my arm over my eyes, like my eyes kind of being covered up by the elbow, the inside
Mhm.
elbow of my arm. And I just couldn't even look at him. Talk about shame, right? So much
Mhm.
shame, as I told him. And I mean, he was incredible, very kind, very loving, very supportive. My story really was that he he doesn't understand. He can't help me. He doesn't understand. He's never had a problem with food.
Oh,
And then I got to realize through a lot of talking with my therapist that he doesn't understand because I haven't given him the
yeah.
opportunity to understand. I haven't told him about it. And so there was a long journey, though, from when I told him. I told a handful of people, some of my closest friends. I really discovered some people were amazing to tell, and some people were very supportive, and other people didn't really know what to do
Yeah.
with the information. So that was really an interesting process. I actually went through 2 rounds of intensive outpatient therapy at a local eating disorders treatment center.
Mm,
So that was certainly part of my journey. Um, and I would have these periods of time where I would have, what I viewed as success, where I would have these kind of times where I felt more in control around food, where the binging wasn't as present, where I thought, okay, I think I'm, kind of getting this, feeling kind of more like a normal eater. And I really always thought, if I ever figure this out, I really want to help other people
mm,
do the same. And on my journey, I really got to the place where I was like, I feel pretty good. I think I know what's going on here. I'm really ready to help other people. And as I started, I got certified as a coach, and I'm starting to, kind of put myself out there and talk about my story and talk about myself. Now, so up until this point, the people that I had told about my experience were my very, very close,
yeah.
very safe inner circle. And so I started talking to more people, which meant that these people who I had been so careful to not ever let know what had happened could now know. And my binging came back. And I went through this period of time where I felt like such a fraud. Here I am, like trying to help other people, but I'm binging. Now I'm binging in secret and feeling even worse about that. So talk about the shame.
Hmm.
Um, and through that process, I actually learned about the nervous system.
Mm,
And then as I started learning about the nervous system, it just changed everything for me. I was like, oh,
yeah.
I get it. I get how talking, kind of putting myself out there, talking about my story, this story that I have kept so carefully guarded.
Hmm.
And then now I put it out to anybody who happens to find it is very much a perceived threat
Yes.
for my nervous system. And what does my brain know how to do to keep me safe? This food thing works really, really
Right.
well. So then that like made so much sense. Now it felt awful at the time, but it was such a gift really to have this knowledge and this understanding of the nervous system, which I just think is the missing, like literally the missing piece for
Yeah.
so many people, is that understanding how so many of us, we figure out pretty amazingly so in whatever period of our life, we figure out that food really can soothe.
Hmm.
Food can help regulate your nervous system. It works. That's why it's so compelling and
Hmm.
so many people struggle with it. But if you can see, oh, that's what's happening. Oh, my nervous system is really dysregulated. Oh, this is what's happening. Then I can come in and I can find another way to regulate myself. I can find another way so that the binge doesn't, it's just a tool that I don't need to use
Yeah.
anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think what you said that's so key. Well, there's a couple things. One, the idea that you started talking to a professional first who,
Yeah.
one, if they didn't like you, if you're big, because that's going to be your biggest fear when you tell people you're going to be rejected, they aren't going to like you, they're going to reinforce all the shame stories that you already have about yourself. Well, this person is seemingly safe, even though it's still a risk to tell somebody because that's their job and they're not in your day to day life. If they didn't like you and they did all the terrible things you're afraid of, you just don't see them again and it's fine.
Yeah.
So there's some benefit to that. But then I think the really powerful piece of her encouraging you to invite people in your life in, because we
Yes.
know that, we talked about sort of the twofold layering of the shame in it, that secrecy piece and that judgment. When you tell somebody about it, now you have sort of a shared accountability with people, but you also get to experience maybe all of those stories and the intensity of those stories that I have about myself isn't true. It doesn't
Yeah.
make the binging go away. And if it did, there's still some stuff to sort through because external validation isn't ultimately going to be the healing spot for us. So even if everyone's like, I'm here for you, this is great, we still have to do our own work. I think the interesting thing when I first told people about my eating disorder was I felt like because it had been such a big deal for me, like this has taken up so much of my time. Go through so many post-it notes of just writing and rewriting what I could eat, when I could eat it, how much I ate, trying to count calories, navigating the moments I felt like I had a good day, a bad day, all of that stuff. When I told people, they were like underwhelmed. Like they were just kind of like, okay, what do you need? Like, how do I be
Yes.
here for you? But like, you're still this person that I love and I know and I care about all these things. Like, this is one part of it. And I remember almost being angry that people didn't have as big of a reaction I assumed they would. And my
Yeah.
first point was then I felt more shame of like, now you've
Mm.
made this even worse. And then, gosh, I took it so many layers because I was constantly rationalizing that things were fine. So then it's like, well, maybe then it's not that bad. So I would go through
Mm.
these bouts back and forth. But I do know that once I let people in, I was able to start figuring out some of the other pieces that came up because I would basically binge anytime I was alone, anytime I could. And I struggled. Again, I started with restriction. Binging came in when I was so severe. And so I did a lot of purging, typically by throwing up, but there were a lot of other ways I could purge. And so I was doing this cycle anytime I was alone. And I couldn't, to me, it wasn't like, well, you had a bad day and so you're binging. So I'm like, well, I don't know how you break it because I don't understand what's going on. And similarly, as I went through treatment, I had some unfortunate experiences with people claimed that they were eating disorder therapists. Now, having gone through specialization and training, I realize anybody can say that they're trauma informed. It doesn't necessarily mean they are. Anyone can say they work with eating disorders. Doesn't necessarily mean that's really where they belong in the scope of
Yeah.
practice. So a lot of my work ended up being kind of on my own, which was hard. But realizing, I think in a similar way, I was so emotionally dysregulated and had spent so many years needing to be the person that was fine and could handle
Yes.
anything for everyone else. My
Yes.
body didn't want anyone else to see me falling apart. I was afraid of them thinking, I was lazy, I couldn't handle it, whatever. But mostly I was afraid of the domino effect it would have on my relationship with them. Because then if
Mm.
they didn't come to me anymore, if they didn't need me because they saw me as being weak and I needed them, of course they would leave because people will
Mm.
only stick around if they need you. That was the story. That was where it was. And so a lot of the undoing really was around so many of these pieces of starting to establish a sense of self-trust of why do
Yes.
I need to feel needed by other people? Why am I constantly afraid of abandonment? And starting to heal some of those things. But I got to tell you, there were days I'm like, I really wish it was just the food. Like
Just the food, right?
I
It
just
would
wish
be.
it was this. Because that
Yes.
means if I don't want to do these behaviors, I have to deal with this other stuff. And it sounds like that's what you saw when you started sharing. You're like, I got this.
Yeah.
I've got these behaviors under control. This would happen a
Yeah.
lot when people would come in the therapy room. I'm like, look, we could get you to stop binging
Yeah.
probably in a few weeks, honestly.
Yeah.
Like if we just are going for behavior change, we could do it. And then you're going to have a period where something stressful happens and it's either going to reemerge or you're going to find a new outlet, like a new volcanic eruption and another addiction as a forms of trying to regulate a dysregulated nervous system.
Yeah.
So we have to go deeper. But I don't know if this came up for you, but I do feel like once I became aware of that, it didn't feel exciting at first. I ran from it as hard as I could, and I almost
Mm.
tried to figure out if there's a way I could keep these behaviors because I was so afraid of what doing that work would mean.
Mhm.
And would I be able to come through the other side of it and be okay? Because at least this sucked, but it was a suck I could deal with. It was predictably crappy.
Yeah, the familiar
Yeah.
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So how does that sort of compare to what you experienced? And just when you start to think about the aha of the nervous system, but also the like, oh, shoot, there's this big, deeper thing and stuff that's decades deep of healing that I have
Mhm.
to do, and now you subsequently try to help other people do.
Yeah. I think there is this combination of like, I can remember several times thinking, maybe I would just want to just keep binging. There are some attractive parts of it. I
Yeah.
don't have to deal with these things. I don't have to look at this
Mhm.
stuff. I can just go eat whatever I want, whenever I want. When I get upset, I can just go do this. Like there are some attractive parts. If it wasn't attractive in some way or another, we wouldn't do it.
Right.
It wouldn't be so hard to let go of or to unwind.
Right.
So I can definitely remember several times thinking, no, maybe I am okay. Maybe I'm good here. But I always thought that in the moment where I was a little more, I don't know, a little more together. Like I never thought it after a binge
Yeah.
when I'm in this like
Yes.
pure misery.
Yes.
Never did I think, oh yeah, maybe we're okay right here.
Yeah.
That's in the like, this is not okay.
Yeah. Well, and I'm curious because, we're both starting to get at this idea that our healings, respectively, had to go through a realization that there was something bigger going on. And we've kind of hinted at this idea of a dysregulated nervous system. And if we're being honest, I think the majority of people, particularly now, have some form of dysregulation in their nervous system. If we look at
Of
just the
course,
past few
yeah.
years, COVID, political unrest, wars, like there is enough on the grand scheme of things, and we're not even factoring in people's day-to-day lives to say we likely have an overtaxed nervous system, and most of us did not grow up developing the skills to know how to manage and regulate that in an adaptive way or a healthy way for us individually. And so, okay, that's kind of the umbrella, but I know we've talked a little bit about you've kind of come to realize that there are 8 kind of reasons or guiding points that end up leading to somebody developing, whether it's binge eating or they may have experienced binges or maybe other addictive patterns. Can you tell us what those are?
Yeah, it's so interesting. As we've been talking about it, I'm like, oh, I think we've talked about at least 6, if not 7 of
Uh-huh.
them already. So I'm just gonna. Here's what I'm gonna do. I'm just gonna run through the 8 reasons why. And you mentioned in the intro the way that I look at binge eating is I think of binge eating is really it's a symptom. So I like to think when a binge happens, it's a light on the dashboard. It tells us there's something going on under the hood. And
Mhm.
so if we can get under the hood, then we can really get to the root cause of what's going on. Why is this happening?
Mhm.
So, if we go into the 8 reasons, the number one reason is shame and judgment. So, it's shame over the behavior, just like you were talking about how when we have like that 2 layer of shame,
Mhm.
we're judging ourselves. I should know better. I should do this. And we're trying to hide. We don't want anybody to know that it does keep us in the cycle. And the way that I really visualize shame and judgment is if we're talking about trying to get under the hood to see what's causing those lights to come on. Shame and judgment is the 50-pound weight that is on top of the hood of the car. And we
Mhm.
can't even get under the hood if shame and judgment are present. And so, with shame, as we know from Brene Brown, she tells us shame can't survive in the light. So
Right.
just like we've been talking about, when you have somebody to talk to, whether it's a professional, whether it's somebody in your life, then we can get under the hood and we can kind of see what's going on.
Mhm.
So that's the very first reason. The second reason is we've also talked about, and it is absolutely and I believe this is really at the heart of most binge eating is restriction, a period of time of
Mhm.
extreme dieting. Was the case for you. It was the case for me, probably for a year and a half before I went to college. I had done some very extreme dieting.
Mhm.
And restriction really comes in 2 ways. It can be mental, it can be physical restriction, which is dieting,
Right.
essentially, as we all know, trying to limit what you're eating. But there's also mental restriction. And the mental restriction is when we just, in our minds, we're saying, don't eat too much of that. You can only have one of those things. Well, you can have this
Mhm.
today, but not tomorrow. If you eat this, then we can't have this later. That type of thing. We're going to a party tonight, so let's be really
Mhm.
careful with what we eat during the day. So there's this mental restriction as well. So
Mhm.
that's reason number 2. Reason number 3, we've talked about dysregulated nervous system. Reason number 4 is disconnection from your body. So we were all born connected to our body. We knew what our body signals were, but over time and over the years, for a lot of reasons, we have learned how to disconnect from our bodies. Any one of us who have been on any, all of the diets, we literally are training ourselves to not honor our signals. To, if I do this, I can get rid of my hunger. If I, just drink a whole bunch of water, then maybe I won't notice. If I just have a lot of coffee, put something in it in the morning, it's like we've trained ourselves to disconnect. So this disconnection from the body, and not only our hunger signals and our fullness signals, but fatigue. And how often I am so guilty of this. I will be working and I'll be kind of in the middle of something. How often do I try to hold back my need to urinate? Well, I'll pee in a little bit, And so that type of thing, just disconnection from what our body's telling us. Number 5 is a coping mechanism. So many of us, I know this was a huge one for me. We didn't grow up learning about our emotions or talking about our emotions. We didn't do emotions in my house. When we would have conflicts, I would go to my room, slam the door. My mom would go to her room, leave. And we just didn't talk about it. The next morning, we all came out as if nothing ever happened. And so when I went to college, not only did I have this big, long period of previous dieting, I was away from my friends, my family, anybody else. And I was feeling these really big emotions, but I didn't know what they were. I didn't have the skills to talk about them. I had no tools really for my emotions. So food can become a way to either escape, cover it up, feel better, just get away from those uncomfortable sensations. Reason number 6, attempt to control. We've talked about this, right? We're trying to control. A lot of times we're trying to control our body. I want my body to look this way. I want it to be this size. I want it to look like this particular person's body. Or I'm just trying to control everything else in my life. And I think if I can control exactly what I eat and what I'm doing, then these other things I don't want to happen won't happen. Number 7 is habit. Anything we do consistently, our brain wants to turn into a habit to conserve energy. So yes, binge eating can become a habit. The problem is a lot of approaches and a lot of people, they just try to look at the habit. Oh, well, let me go read this book on habits and apply this to my binge eating. And then why isn't it going away? Well, because we haven't addressed the other 7 reasons. If the other 7 reasons are there, no, habit formula or atomic habits or any of these other things is going to work if we're not addressing the others. But it does become a habit if it's something that you have done on this particular day, at this particular time, in this particular location for years, if not for some people, decades. And then the last reason is negative self-talk. It's the way we talk in our heads to ourselves about ourselves. And while, you talked about it earlier, so much of it happens while we're even in the process of eating. Can't believe I'm doing this. Here I go again. I know better than this. I'm going to feel so bad later. That really happens. For me, what was really interesting is I realized that it took me a while to figure this out, but I realized that when I would binge, it was like me slamming the door on myself. It's like, that's how I learned to really quiet the negative self-talk, because for me, I kind of talked about it like when I would binge, it was like turning the lights off. I'm not hearing anything. I'm not feeling anything. I'm not doing anything. It is me. And what else? What else can I eat? What am I going to do? Where am I going to go next? What am I going to get next? How am I going to just avoid anybody seeing me? That really is the only thing I'm thinking about. So then if we look at the 8 reasons, each reason has its corresponding solution. Then. So we can kind of look at, understanding with shame and judgment. The solution to shame and judgment is just understanding. Why? How does it make sense that this started? So I love this approach. I know for me, when I could really look back and just be like, oh, wow. When I was in college, that first year of college, in that month of October, it's like, wow. Yeah, I had gone through this huge period of restriction. All of this was going on. I did have these emotions, all of this. It's like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. then I can start seeing this as, oh, maybe I'm not actually broken. Maybe it's not that there's something wrong with me. If this starts to make sense, now it appears as though there's a solution and I can figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
So that's solution number one. And then just to go through the rest of the solutions, if reason number two is restriction, the solution is to remove restrictions. Number three, dysregulated nervous system, to really learn your nervous system, work with your nervous system. Reason number four, disconnection from the body. The solution is to learn how to reconnect with your body and your signals. Number five, the coping mechanism. The solution is to expand what I call your emotional capacity, your capacity to be with any emotion. Number six, attempt to control. The solution here is to develop what I call two-way trust. So it's trust. It's you trusting that your body is going to communicate with you. Your body's going to tell you when it's hungry, when it's had enough, when it's tired, when it anything. And then your body trusts that when it communicates with you, you are going to listen. So two-way trust. And then seven is the habit. So the solution, break the habit. And then eight, the negative self-talk. The solution there is to change the internal dialogue. It's kind of like changing the radio station that's on in your car all the time.
When I think, you're sharing these pieces, and there's going to be some people that are listening to this and are going to go, okay, I'm still taking notes on the 8 reasons. And now, okay, you're giving me the 8 solutions, and they're going to hear it the same way that you're describing some of the other responses that don't work. Some of the like, well, let's just get you to stop
Yeah.
binging. And I think it's
Yeah.
because we often hear things, we want it to be as quick and digestible as possible. And we
Yeah.
create, even if what you're saying is not actually just, we'll do this and it's done. I'm telling you, here's the 8 reasons. So tonight you shouldn't binge. We're saying each one of those is weeks or months of therapy or coaching and support and focusing on one at a time, not all 8 at a time. And so, one of the things that came up for me was this idea that our culture, not only are we in a culture that says certain bodies and appearance are better, whether we're talking about weight, gender presentation, race, like there's these ideas that someone's body can be compared to someone else's, and there's a person that's going to win and a person that's going to lose. So we're always on this hunt that we need to make our specific body better. Weight loss has been one of the dominant stories that's been fed to us, that we can get ahead of other people. So that sort
Yeah.
of social competition and comparison really drives us forward. And so a lot of this is also this idea that we've tried to logic our way through an emotional experience, meaning
Yes.
life is an emotional experience. We are emotional beings that have the capacity for higher functioning cognitive thought, but we're trying to logic our way through everything and make it as quick as possible because we're so focused on the race, we don't know how to be. And so a lot of that
Yes.
for us is, well, I just need you to help me break the habit. I just want to stop binging. I don't want to do this anymore. We develop avoidant habits. I don't actually know what I want. I just know I don't want to do this. And so we end up hopping from addiction to addiction, or pain point to pain point, or avoidance strategy to avoidance strategy. And so, I think there's a couple things in what you said that become really key for people to take away from. One, the cool thing is it's a podcast. So you can go back and you can re-listen to those 8 reasons and those 8 steps as many times as you want. 2, in the show notes, you're going to have access to reach out to Jane so that you can have a one-on-one conversation with her. If you're like, I want to start doing some work with her, you'll have resources that she has available. But 2, if you're like, okay, I need it to be a little bit more bite-sized, in the sense that if I try to take all 8 pieces at once, I'm going to lose myself. I think the biggest thing that Jane just said that's really key, we have been conditioned to feel as though we are not enough, and that we are always on the hook for figuring out how to do more, be more, have more to be okay. And in that, our body became a nuisance. I can't afford to take a lunch break because I have to work harder to be better than my coworker. I can't afford to get the 7 or 8 hours of sleep because I've got to catch up on these other things that I need to get done to prove my worth and value. I have done the same thing about getting up to pee. I will convince myself that I can be fine. Your body becomes a nuisance. Your emotions become a nuisance.
Yeah.
And that's a story that's been passed down. So we don't know how to handle it. Your body is still depending on emotional and physical connection and regulation. So when we don't give it that, food just becomes a really easy access point. Your body's starved. I mean, often literally starved for nutrition, but also starved for some form of regulation. It's going to grab the first thing that it can. And typically, we've seen it modeled to us. And if it wasn't modeled, it was taught to us. If you lose weight, you're going to be happier. If you stop eating these things, you'll be happier. So, one of the things that I'll often get at with clients is, how could you expect it would have gone any other way? Like, write me a different story, keeping all the context of the life that you've just shared with me. Gosh, this makes so much sense. And I sometimes feel like the moment we can do that, then we can get to that place of compassionate curiosity. Now,
Yeah.
I can't write a different story for you. I wish the first 3, 4 decades looked different or 5 decades looked different. They don't. This is how you got to be where you are. Now, how do we write a different story? And how do we get curious about all those elements from that first part of your story that you're going to try to shove in the bag, that we're going to try to work on leaving behind, and that we need to take it with us in the bag because they help us really think about you as a full person. So I want to think about this as people are listening to this and they're going, okay, I see this. I see this is all happening. I'm recognizing that I'm disconnected from my body. I have developed these habits that aren't super healthy for me and all these things. I don't know if I can take it all in at one moment. I hear, Kyira, what you're saying. You're breaking it down more, but I think I might just need it. I might need one invitation. I might need one piece for today. That might be the only amount I can develop or muster up some of that compassionate curiosity.
Yeah.
What would be one thing that you would want to give to the listener that they could take today?
Yeah, I love this invitation. And I really think, I mean, there is no magic pill to end binge eating. But if there was, it would be one word. And so this is the one word that I would invite you to take with you and to just marinate on, just to let sink in, put your brain to work on. And this word is connection. It's connection with yourself, connection with your body, connection with your needs, connection with just connection. Your body is always, always, always communicating with you. We've just really stopped listening.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can tune in, if you can connect, and the body has, like, I love the way that you said that the body's become a nuisance.
Mm-hmm.
And if the body's become a nuisance, then it's like, I don't have time for you. You just go over here and get in the closet and I'm not going to look at you. I'm not going to listen to you, nothing.
Yeah.
So we're disconnecting.
Yeah.
But, and I believe binging is a symptom of disconnection.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take one thing from this conversation, and it only feels possible for you to take one thing in, take in the word connection.
Mm.
How can I cultivate some connection with myself? Is my body actually talking to me? And maybe I haven't
Mm-hmm.
been tuning in. What does my body, as you're listening right now, what is your body saying to you?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes people will say, when I invite the connection, invite the inquiry, they'll say, I don't know. I have no idea. It's just because you haven't asked and you
Yeah.
haven't been asking the question. So keep asking and the answers will come.
Mm-hmm.
It's not because it's not possible or you can't do it. It's just because it's a new inquiry. But if you keep asking, the answers will come.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that invitation. And I think a lot about what healing looks like. Again, going back to this idea of shame resilience, I think so much. So, eating disorders in the DSM recovery used to be listed as partial remission and full remission. Actually, now that I'm not actively doing diagnostics, I don't know if that's shifted even more. But the idea that you're either partially recovered or you're fully recovered. And the goal is you got to get to full recovery. And I remember being like, I don't think you know what it means to live in the world today. It is not reasonable and feasible for me to live my life without having a negative body image some days, or for me to not feel like I am not enough, or for me to be preoccupied with my body, whether it's my weight, my appearance in this outfit, the food that I ate. Like, that's going to happen. That's just part of living a normal life. So I think some of it is also I think what you said so beautifully in the beginning is this idea of the silence is what continues to create the disconnection. It's the
Yeah.
not talking about, for so many people, that disconnection from their body is a result of trauma that's gone unresolved,
Yes.
unprocessed, invalidated by maybe their loved ones throughout the time. Even the idea of, you guys all knowing how to shut your doors and to walk away, that's an invalidation of pain and rupture and it's not
Yes.
healed. And so if we can come back to that space of recognizing some of this connection is about just, I'm going to put a light here. And
Mhm.
I'm going to wonder. And then not to go, well, gosh, see, I can't even figure out what my body's telling me. No, no, no. That's that invitation back to number one. We're not going there. We're just going, oh, I'm going to notice that today I don't know what the answer is. I asked the question. That's the only thing I could control, is that I was willing to ask the question. My body's working on trusting me again. And maybe right now it doesn't know that it's safe to say it loud enough to me and that I'm going to do anything with it. So even thinking about that idea of vulnerability, like sometimes I don't want to tell somebody something if I'm afraid it's just going to be like, well, it doesn't matter. I'm going to do something else. So your body's got
Yes.
to also rebuild its voice to trust, like you said, two-way trust. When I talk, Jane's going to listen. Jane's going to go to the
Yes.
bathroom when I say I have to go to the bathroom. Jane's going to have a snack when I say, no, I'm hungry, even though Jane's brain says we shouldn't need to eat until 12:30. No, no, no. I'm telling Jane I'm hungry now, and Jane's going to listen to me. I'm going to trust
Yes.
that. Jane, this has been amazing. I think we are just barely scratching the surface, I think, on just this topic as a whole, the importance of this topic as it relates to shame. But I think really, for many people, the next step, often when we think about connection, is to start to figure out what that looks like then to get connection with someone who can help them in this process. And I know that that is something that you do for people. And so I'm curious if they're like, yeah, Jane's my person. I am all in. I need her in my life. Where do I find her? What is the best place for people to go to find you?
The best, easiest place is to go to my website, janepilger.com. The other is I have a podcast. It's called the Binge Breakthrough Podcast. Lots of episodes on all kinds of topics. There are episodes on each of these 8 reasons. If you go back to the very beginning of the podcast, the first episode is my story. And then I do a deep dive into each of these reasons and the solutions. So if you resonated with this and you want to go a little bit deeper into it, the podcast is a great place. I also want to mention one other episode about the podcast just to provide a resource for what we talked about earlier, which is if you have not talked to anybody in your life and you're considering maybe doing that, I've got an episode called How to Talk to Your Loved Ones About Your Secret Eating. And it's a great episode where I don't assume that talking to your loved ones is a good idea because it may or may
Mm-hmm.
not be based upon your relationship. But I give you some great questions to consider, and there's even a worksheet that you can kind of go through. And then there's some language given there that can, if you decide yes, I do want to do this, I give you some language to do that. So I know it's such an important conversation and a really challenging one. So that's another great resource that's available for you.
I love that. So I will make sure, listeners, that all of this is down in the show notes for you to find, for you to connect. I highly encourage you to go to her website and just check out all of the resources. Send a message to her directly, get in touch if you're interested in doing some one-on-one work, being able to reach out, and just knowing that Jane is in the process with you. I think that is one of the biggest things. We don't necessarily have to have someone that knows the exact thing that we've gone through to be able to understand it. And as a fellow person in recovery from an eating disorder, I know that there's a benefit to somebody recognizing that there's a nuance and that it is an iterative process, and to help walk with you in that, and to be able to even share with you that moment when we've told ourselves we backslid, we're terrible, we screwed up, and what we did to navigate through those pieces. Because that connection, coming back to your word and the gift you gave everybody today, I think is powerful. And to see, oh, Jane did that too. And Jane's here talking about this and able to navigate these next steps. So gosh, maybe that's part of the process. It doesn't mean I'm failing.
Yeah, absolutely. It is, I think, a gift. I think it's a gift that I give not only to myself, but also to my clients is
Yeah.
really here's how this shows up for me. Here's how I'm working through this. And whether it's food related or in some other area of my life, I'm always sharing how I'm working through challenges and things in my own life. Because I think it's important that we all know we're all humans
Hmm.
navigating just a very challenging world. And
Yeah.
the more we can navigate this together and see how we get through the hard times and how we grow the resilience, that shame resilience, I love that term. It's how we grow, and we don't stay hiding because we think we're not enough, or we should be better, or we should be doing it any differently than we are.
I love that. So, listeners, just remember you can come back to this episode as many times as you want and you need to. We don't need to get it all, solve it all, fix it all right away. That's that hustle culture. That's that scarcity mindset that says we have to fix it. You're not broken. We're learning. We're creating space to get curious about how we show up in the world and how that's connected to stories, to experiences, to pain that is allowed to take up space and to be healed. You'll have access to all of those resources that Jane mentioned in the show notes. And of course, we're going to be back next Sunday with another episode. Until then, please share this episode with anyone you think could benefit from hearing it. Leave us a comment so we can hear what's resonating with you. If there's a specific reason that's really salient right now that you're working through. And of course, ask us questions if we want Jane back and what do we want to be talking about at a future time. But until then, let's all take that connection piece with us. Let's invite that in, and I will see you all back here next Sunday.